Cybersecurity is at least as old as the internet, a constantly evolving game of cat and mouse, and there are so many different kinds of mice in this house, from criminals seeking financial gain to the pranksters after bragging rights to corporate spies to state actors who are working to undermine sovereignty in other countries to conducting all-out cyber war. And today we're going to explain how the AI game is changing, how the mice are continuing to mutate, and what the cats in business and government are doing to win. And I'd like to start, if I may, with John. John, you've worked at the very highest levels of the national security community in the United States. Can you bring us up to date? How are the bad guys using AI to do what they do?
Yeah, and thanks for being here today. It's such an important topic, and unfortunately, for those of you running businesses, you are the target of a range of actors on a threat that the intelligence community inside the United States and working with partners universally have described as getting worse. And when I talk about that threat picture, I mean it across the range of cyber threats, but they will be applicable in new and particular ways to the development of artificial intelligence. So if you divide it into three buckets, really, nation-state actors, in particular, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, are quite active. And when I say quite active, I mean on almost a weekly basis with not just large companies, but medium-sized companies as well. We are seeing those threat actors inside your systems doing a range of attack. So it could be from the collection of intelligence for foreign intelligence value, and China is particularly prevalent in that area. It could be in order to raise money. So in some ways, North Korea is, at this point, the world's largest bank robber. Sanctions have been effective at denying them fiat currency, denying them access to the banking system and the dollar, and they've responded by attempting to get you to transfer your hard-earned money to them, using a variety of false pretenses and then transferring it through digital currency, through the blockchain, which means in today's day and age, it makes it easier for them to do the transfer, but it also makes it visible and permanently legible so that you can see where they have stolen the money and where it's sitting and where they're trying to get it off of the blockchain. And Iran has done a variety of all of the above. They collect intelligence, they steal money, but they also do disruptive attacks and are looking to get into your infrastructure to disrupt in the future. Those are the nation states. You also have this incredibly successful new business model for criminals. So if you go onto the internet today, know where to look, you can go essentially to Amazon for crooks, and they're advertising their services. And when I call it Amazon for crooks, I mean it's complete with reviews. So you'll go on and they'll say, you know, this crook said he had, X% of stolen credit cards, and he did, 5 stars, great service. And then the ones I always enjoy, it'll be like 1 star. This group, whose name is something like In Fraud We Trust, is not trustworthy. After all, 1 star, they stole my money. So that it's become so sophisticated that it's really a hierarchical market on the back end, with some groups specializing in breaking into your companies, other groups on how to monetize once they broke in by making it a sophisticated extortion scheme. They are not disconnected from the nation-state threat. So they're often harbored in nation-states that don't share a value, and some of them are the same groups, call this the blended threat, that sometimes attack you just for money and sometimes at the direction of the state. And I'll wrap just quickly hitting a couple ways in which AI is accelerating these developments,
Please, yes.
but also maybe part of the solution. So one, when you think about what some of the schemes do, they pretend to be someone in your organization. They call this sometimes social engineering, in order to trick you to gaining access, in order to hack you, or to get you to approve the transfer of money or other goods or documents. With AI, and particularly the ability to imitate people's voices and images, the controls that you used to put in place are going to be challenged, and the solution may ultimately be more AI on defending on the back end. The other new developments, they use it in order to examine your code. So they'll look for vulnerabilities in code and what they used to take human effort, and now they're trying to do it through machine learning. Again, On the defensive side, that means using AI to check code so you find those vulnerabilities first. The third area is unique if you're using AI. And so you need to look at, and we'll talk about this more, your supply chain in terms of who is producing the machine learning that you're using. And sometimes you'll be renting or leasing or getting that AI service from somebody else. Are the chips compromised? And then unique to AI is this idea of poisoning the well. So machine learning learns from the information that is analyzed, right? And so if you put fake, false information into that chain, the machine learning can end up generating hallucination or false results. In all of these areas, we're already seeing criminal groups, nation states adopting machine learning into their tactics, and now it's up to us to figure out how to counter it.
Goodness, that's quite sobering. And am I right to understand that the more a company adopts AI, the more it's increasing its own surface area for attack? Rosanne, you're nodding. Is that the case?
It is, because the more data you process, the faster the AI will learn. So I think to your well-made point, whatever is going into the system is more of what will come out. And there was actually some quite interesting development at the Munich Security Forum, where they were asking companies who are processing large amounts of data and creating visual imagery, because obviously deepfakes are a huge concern when it comes to misinformation, that they would tag those videos or those memes to say this is AI generated, but they're all voluntary, so being voluntary doesn't really have very much teeth. And so you can see the potential legislation that might come in to help mitigate that, but also the fact that you would see this order of magnitude of more and more and more data going into the system and more learning happening. But I thought it was actually just quite an interesting point that you were making around the security and the use of ML for securitization, because we've also seen a little bit of the idea that AI has been around for a long time in the form of ML, and that has been used for security for a long time. But yet actually, if we all cast our minds back to like 1983 or 1984 when TCP came in and VertSurf, none of these systems were actually built for security. So when we run ML across that, actually it's playing catch up all the time. Whereas now we're in the position with AI and the type of infrastructure and the supply chain that we are using to actually build for security, to build with that security in mind. But it's almost like we're slipping behind already. So it's just an interesting thought that I thought you were putting across.
It's such an important point. If you think about the design, and wrote a book on cybersecurity and had the opportunity to interview those who designed the internet in the first instance, who came up with the so-called TCP/IP protocol. And they talked about a very conscious design decision where they thought about whether or not to build it with security in mind. And because it was really designed for academics to share information at the time, they intentionally built a system without security in mind. And then the rest of us managed to adopt that and use it from everything from the planes in our skies and drones to the internet connected vehicles, which are increasingly computers on wheels, on the street, and we did so without properly pricing or thinking about security on the front end, and we've been playing a game of catch-up ever since. I think in the policy community, in the halls in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, in London, the discussion has been, can we avoid making that mistake again as we adopt AI, and think about not just how all the incredible positive effects, but get in the mind of our adversaries, the terrorists, the spies, the crooks, and think about how they might take advantage of it and try to protect against that on the front end.
So I think the comments that we've been listening to so far, it's fascinating because you've got this multi-layered onion of a problem when it comes to AI and cybersecurity. There's what I'd call the more retail end of it, which is how these attackers are using AI tools to change the way they do attacks. We spent a lot of time talking about nation states. I think one of the most interesting examples is financial fraudsters using that ability. Just us sitting here on the stage will probably use enough of our voice to enable some fraudster using deepfakes to really realistically simulate our voice.
Right.
And so if you're a bank or if you're an individual banking customer and you suddenly hear your spouse on the phone saying, hey, I'm broke down on the side of the road, I need you to wire me $1,000 right now. I see that sort of retail use of AI for cybercrime. It's like one example maybe on the outer layer of the onion. But the really deeper layers start to get fascinating. Not just how nation-state actors are potentially going to leverage these tools to find their ways into systems, but the way that the concern about technology's vulnerability to being breached in that way is driving just a fundamental restructuring of the way governments look at the technology stack that powers AI.
Yes.
And is leading to some really, I would argue, radical policy moves.
We're talking about supply chains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Government's really starting to look in a much more holistic way, building up these portfolios of policy levers that they can pull to try to manage supply chain risks, not just adversary states accessing your network through intrusions, but also deeply embedded in the entire supply chain that powers AI down to the hardware layer, really thinking about including hardware from China, for example, in US critical infrastructure. And I think that what we've seen in the headlines about cyber risks lately only has reinforced that feeling in Washington and other national capitals that's driving this really big policy shift.
Right.
You know, fundamentally, for the first 30 years of the internet, there was generally an idea that technology, data, people, capital were moving more or less freely. China was some exceptions around data, but US companies used China for their supply chain. They used it as a source of revenue. And now this concern that is amplified by AI about cybersecurity is changing all of that, and I think creating a very complex set of problems for CEOs and businesses.
Interesting. So on the one hand, we've got AI supercharging a very familiar modus operandi, but then we've also got Terra Nova. We've got the poisoning the well phenomena that you called, including with data, and then we've got this deeper question of hardware and the whole of the stack, in fact. Let's move on to solutions. Let's understand how the cats in business and government are fighting back. Presumably, they have to get faster and smarter, but they also have to evolve. And you see that this new kind of policy in terms of export controls, supply chain management, as one of the tools to fight back.
That's right. I mean, I think managing these more retail risks, figuring out either technological or institutional innovations to manage the deepfakes problem.
Okay.
That's like table stakes. That is like fundamental cybersecurity bread and butter that I think every company will have to think carefully about. I think it's that those deeper issues, companies now more than ever really need to understand at a deep level what exactly is in the supply chain that makes their technology work. They need to understand it not only to understand where potentially bad actors, whether they're criminals or whether they're nation states, could try to exploit that entire supply chain, but they also need to understand how the policy risk that is arising to that supply chain from the US policy toolkit and from, frankly, China's policy toolkit, as well as from issues around Taiwan, how all of that will affect their product design strategies, their business growth strategies, not to mention sort of the standard bread and butter of cyber defense.
And this is fascinating because, John, I think a lot of people, and Rosanne too, have sort of left cybersecurity to the IT department. This is a whole of business. Your C-suite needs to be across these questions, but how do you get them there? How does the cyber team get the attention of the C-suite on this?
Well, I'll say, this was a major problem in cybersecurity going back, and so sometimes we talk about a translation issue of just literally the people on the information technology and security side of the house were speaking geek, and the business side is speaking in terms of business terms and financial risk that they're used to managing, and the two just could not communicate. And so the role sometimes of lawyers, consultants, and the chief information security officer at the top of that chain was to find people that could just translate their respective languages of risk into one that a business executive could apply. One way that I think is quite helpful in tackling this is something we call wargaming or tabletopping, which is use a factual scenario that's applicable to your business, that draw it from real world events, like how it may impact you. Do it in chapters, essentially where it gets gradually worse. This is maybe a 75-minute, 90-minute exercise, so not long. And walk through an incident and have the C-suite play and role what they would do. And This is an incredibly effective use of time. It's something that I know when I was in government, the President of the United States and the National Security Council and Cabinet took time out of their days to do it, which is a good argument as to why it's worth time out of your day. And while you may not get the scenario right, for instance, we war game for years. What's it going to look like if a rogue nuclear-armed nation attacks the United States through cyber means, and we all got it wrong? I don't know how many of you, we predicted water grid or electric grid. The first major attack was about a movie, The Interview, about a bunch of pot-smoking journalists. Only time in my career I've had to go to the Situation Room, brief the president, and start with a movie synopsis. And for those of you that have seen the movie, it's not an easy movie to give a quick summary of because the movie doesn't make a whole lot of sense, Seth Rogen vehicle. But anyway, that caused North Korea to attack Sony Motion Pictures. And so while we didn't get that scenario right, the type of decision that you have to make, and what's unique in both cyber and AI, is the speed with which you need to make those decisions and the uncertainty. Unlike a hurricane, you don't know the damage that's been done yet, and yet you still need to handle your communications and your policy and give direction to your employees and talk to your customers. You can practice that decision making, and most importantly, if you do it through an exercise, there are front-end investment decisions about where you place your supply chain, how you're protecting your information, that I guarantee, having done so many of these responses after the fact, you will make after you get hit. But if you do it before you get hit, you can save yourself that type of pain and sometimes existential crisis for the business.
Yeah. And Rosanne, with your firm, Northern Data, which is right at the front giving advice to companies on how to leverage high-value, high-capability compute, I can see you vigorously nodding along to this. But what about the companies, of which there are many in the audience, who are AI businesses? What kind of advice are you giving to them at the moment about what they should be doing?
I mean, I've actually really thoroughly enjoyed this because the point around decision making is such an important one, and the investments that you make. I mean, the key thing is don't cut corners and have that reliable strategy around data and security, and one that is fast to detect all of those vulnerabilities. And I make that point specifically because when you cut corners, and because there is such demand for this infrastructure, that you would focus on price rather than security does mean that you're exposed to all those vulnerabilities. So all of the bad actors that we've been talking about are waiting for you to make those decisions. And if you get the answer wrong, the consequences are potentially quite catastrophic. And so if you invest that time to make the right decisions and have the right strategies, you're ultimately a lot more resilient, because there is no ways that we can actually avoid a cyber attack. There is only operational resiliency and actually societal resilience. We have to be ready for those attacks, ready to respond, and ready to really get down to the brass bolts that are going to hold your business and your communities together. And that is the way that we overcome these threats.
Such important, just a 2-second on that, which is on the importance of resiliency. So if you, as the CEO, get briefed that there will not be a successful attack, you have the wrong person in your company.
Absolutely.
So your plan should be, how do I reduce the risk after they get in, or after they disable my ability to use AI for a period of time? What do I do next?
I think another interesting trend here is the way that the cybersecurity industry is investing in AI tools.
Yes.
And so I've heard folks deeply involved in the national security community talking about how, based on the trends that they see today, that they actually feel that because there is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is investing to grapple with the threats posed by AI in cyberspace,
Yes.
that the existence of that private sector industry will ultimately help create more of a flywheel to improve defenses. So we talked early on in the panel about automating scanning for malware. I think that other ways that AI can help, things like understanding what's going on in internet chat rooms or dark web chat rooms about cyber forums. That is something that typically has taken human analysts, but increasingly will be done using generative AI tools.
I see.
So there's lots of exciting areas to think about where actually just using AI applications can make a difference for, again, that very retail end of cybersecurity. But I think the other real fundamental work that companies need to do is that if you have a piece of technology, given the way that concerns about cybersecurity and AI and nation-state competition, nation-state adversaries are creating that deeper disruption that we were talking about, you really need to understand if that technology is in any way important for your business. You need to understand what's in there, the hardware and the software and where it's all coming from, so that you can move forward with a pretty clear-eyed view of cyber risks and also policy risks that are likely to affect that business over time.
Let alone supply chain risks in the event of geopolitical upheaval. I'm fascinated by this idea of the solutions that are available to us with AI. So you've talked about using AI, so you just mentioned briefly, I should say, how AI could be used to monitor chat rooms and pick up on sort of plans, etc. I think it was John that said that AI could be used for sort of scanning vulnerabilities and coming up with solutions. Have you got any other examples of how we're beginning to, cybersecurity firms are beginning to adopt, or national intelligence community is beginning to adopt?
Sure. I mean, first, I guess we should take a step back. What are we talking about when we talk about AI or machine learning? Like, what are the component parts? And it's really the chips, right? So it is physical, and that's where the hardware is coming in. I often laugh. I'm not a marketer, and the term cloud was genius. But for years, I would go in and talk to victims, and they'd say it's in the cloud. I'm like, well, no, the cloud sits somewhere. It's a bunch of physical machines that are connected. And so if someone gets into those machines, it's a problem. Or if those machines are physically disrupted as a supply chain risk, it is then the software or algorithm that you're applying on those chips or hardware. And then it's the data itself. And so when you're thinking about then what the risks are, or how could AI improve my defenses, I think you're seeing machine learning can do. If you think about the resilience concept, okay, one way is to look at the surface area, which we talked about, but another is they're inside somewhere in my system. How do I determine that that's unusual activity? And so what you have right now are human beings often reporting, or automated tools checking to see if something unusual is going on, and then it goes to a human being to do the analysis as to whether or not that's unusual, and they try to fix it. That's the cycle through a security operations center. Machine learning could be incredibly helpful, particularly on more complex companies, to determine whether or not that unusual activity is occurring and monitor it at the speed and scale with which it's occurring. On the flip side, it's also easier for the bad guys to try to evade that type of detection. Also, AI can help with determining the authenticity of AI. So when you're trying to figure out, is that voice fake? Is that video wrong? Applying your AI solution can help you detect the fakes or pick out the disinformation. And finally, in the development of the code itself, so when you're designing something without security in mind, just to get your product out to market, there are always errors. Those are what are the so-called vulnerabilities. If you can red team and use machine learning to figure out how you could take advantage of that software before you release it to market, then you're protecting yourself against essentially the bad guys' machine learning doing the same thing after it gets to market and finding the vulnerability.
Yeah. Goodness. I'm really picking up, thanks to your onion layer metaphor and some of the things you've been saying as well, John, that there is a huge overlap between national security community and corporate community, or rather there is an overlap between the threats they face. Are they working together on the solutions? Is there enough cooperation between those ecosystems, do you think? You're laughing, but perhaps I should let Kevin get out his snort of derision.
It's the perennial question, right, of how can we improve the way that businesses and government work together on these problems. And I don't know what you think. I think we've seen some significant progress on that. Yeah. Certainly over the last half decade, in the US, for example, agencies such as CISA, which is in charge of basically domestic critical infrastructure security, has really started to change the way it interacts with and partners with the private sector. There's a lot of confidence building, trust that has developed over time, even in the absence of kind of comprehensive legislation requiring this in all cases. So it feels like that's a never-ending work in progress, but there is cooperation. I think, though, that just the sheer size of the attack surface that sits in the private sector really means that the private sector is going to have to play a really key role in every aspect of this. And so I think, again, going from that outer layer of the onion, the more kind of retail cybersecurity, a point I wanted to raise earlier is it's not even exclusively about using AI to counter these threats. Some of the ways that you can counter threats that arise because of AI are through completely analog means, just changing the way that you do things institutionally, how you validate customers' identity. It doesn't necessarily need to be fancy, right? But I heard someone on a recent panel saying, no, I've taken to using code words with my parents whenever I speak to them, or I've told them what the code word should be to really know that it's me on the other end of the phone. So that if I'm calling and saying I'm in trouble, I need you to wire me $1,000, you can have a challenge word you could use with me, right? Really basic little
good bit of
little
household
things,
advice, yeah.
right? So, but then again, going further down, whether it's on-prem technology like a data center, or whether it's a cloud kind of access to these tools, so much of this kind of cat and mouse game that you have talked about is going to play out in the private sector. I think that private sector really driving big investments in cybersecurity, including companies that can marshal nearly nation-state-sized resources in countering cyber threats, are going to be critically important, and continuing to pursue deeper and closer partnerships with government agencies working on the pointy end of these problems will be vital.
In fact, Rosanne, the UK just designated data centers as being critical national infrastructure. How do you interpret that?
I mean, I think it's an extremely astute move by the government, because just that designation will help to deter cyber criminals. I mean, if you think about the amount of data that is now being processed through data centers and the type of infrastructure that is being deployed inside of them, particularly when it comes to AI, there is no ways that we can no longer consider it critical infrastructure. That is sovereign infrastructure that needs to be protected. So it's a really, really good move by the UK government. And you see that being echoed in the US and other neighboring countries and states. So the more we do of that, I think the better chance we have of really getting on the defensive and making sure that we're preventing any of the sort of pre-positioning that you see. And you mentioned CISA, and I thought very interesting concepts and stories that I've heard being told coming out of CISA, where in the US we're finding old infrastructure that has got pre-positioning by China and others that is ready to take that infrastructure down. And I mean, when we talk about critical infrastructure, let's just recognize what we're talking about, right? That is the national grid, that is your local ATM, that's water, that's education, that's hospitals. And if that critical infrastructure is compromised, that means your way of life changes. I mean, in a cyber attack, full-scale cyber attack, we are talking about taking down the entire national grid. So data centers being protected, that data inside of it and the way it is processed is paramount. And I mean, this is a very, very good sort of segue into policy and things like the European AI Act and NER in the US.
And John, you're interesting, because if I may say, because you've worked in government and then now you're in private business, that's great skills recycling, may I say. I think that can only be good for the ecosystem. Do you think the cooperation is working? And also I'm interested in your point of view on whether the regulation is in the right place and where that needs to be heading, because it always needs to evolve.
Yeah, I guess I'm not a doctor, but I diagnose that we're at a deep state of schizophrenia when it comes to the regulatory approach to cyber. So on the one hand, you have the security agencies, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Agency inside the US. In the UK, you have the GCHQ that has a component that's customer-facing, that's reaching out to companies that may mess up the acronym, but the National Cyber Safety Security Board, which means you can go into a place that normally you couldn't even find the building and get help when you're dealing with a cyber attack. And when I say they're there to help, I mean, to the point where, and this is very unusual in the US, where the FBI is usually coming to investigate companies, but the head of the top cyber division official in the FBI said, quote, I want to be the Ritz-Carlton of customer service when it comes to victims. He won't say that again. He got immediate problems from other hotel chains. But his bottom line was, we really, when it comes here, we know you're the victim. We know that 90% of the infrastructure is in private hands, and we think of the bad guys as the organized criminal groups or nation states who are going after it. On the other hand, you have the regulators. And it's in the US, it's even more complicated than in the EU, but I think both have a slew of different regulatory authorities. So in the US, you have one incident, you have state authorities with different laws in all 50 states. You have Congress, who's passed some, but nothing complete, that has some regulations, and then you have the different regulatory agencies from the Federal Trade Commission, and then depending on your infrastructure, where it's regulated, different regulators. So if it's telecom, it's one regulator. If it's in the defense industrial base, it's another. And then because if you're a global company, the same incident, you're also dealing with GDPR, the local requirements of a particular country. And so as we're building out on AI, they've all given signals that they want to regulate in this space. I think right now the EU is moving towards a more prescriptive model with set rules on what you can do or not do. The US is more using the power of the pulpit to explain what they think best practices are, and then under our system, you often find out after the fact through enforcement, through civil action or regulatory enforcement. So now I think is a time when you're thinking through your risks, you got to think, what are the risks of the bad guys, but also what are the risks of the regulators to my business, and how might they second guess later what my security practices are or how I'm using AI?
Yeah, but this is the last outcome that you want with regulation, a sort of patchwork effect across markets that makes the cost of doing business, such a vital business for everybody, so difficult. Does this come up a lot in the conversations you're having with your clients, Rosanne?
I think much more than just the regulation. The regulation is generally very focused around how we protect data and how we secure that environment. So, I have a slightly different view. For me, the European AI Act is certainly something that I think is a bit of a lighthouse in terms of the way that other countries should be looking at protecting their citizens' data and also regulating how that data is used in other parts of the world and on other infrastructure. Because if that data is not protected, if governments do not regulate the way their citizens' data is protected, you're essentially handing over the most powerful commodity you have to any other nation state, and it can be used in any way that you want. So for us as a business, everything we do, as I said, is focused at building our infrastructure in the most secure way, but we also house that in Europe where there is regulation around the way that data is processed and stored, so that we can offer businesses like those in this room the security and the reliance and the resiliency to say your data is managed and moderated in the way that it should be according to this legislation. And that allows other businesses and other governments actually to take some cues from that.
And returning to the center of the onion and the issue of supply chain, there's a whole different current of policy making around that, particularly emanating from the United States.
Yeah, I'll give a good example. Just in recent weeks, the Commerce Department has advanced a new rule which will, in about 5 years, require any connected vehicles in the US will no longer be allowed to have Chinese technology or software powering the comms link and also powering autonomous driving systems. And this is really all about the different threats that we were discussing. The US perceives national security risks in having cars that are packed full of high-definition cameras and LiDARs going around scanning the environment to do their autonomous driving, and having potentially that type of data being at risk of being exploited by a foreign adversary. It's that concern that's driving this push. It's very much a cyber risk connected to an AI application. I'd say fine, but there is a whole other flip side to this, which is that as you start to lock down that supply chain, there arises a question of, if you're not getting it from China, where are you getting it from? That I think we still haven't fully answered yet.
Right.
But I will say, like the mood music in Washington, both major political parties in the US are singing from the same hymn sheet in this. The music is very much saying, this is only going to continue. I think after connected vehicles, I would not be surprised to see things like drones or other types of connected devices. In the headlines in the US recently, we had port cranes. You can imagine almost any device in the future will be connected. And so I think where you see, or where the government sees those national security risks, if you're a company whose products are that technology or that rely on it, you've got a lot of work to do to kind of unravel not only where you see the cyber risks going, but where you see the policy risks evolving.
Right. But
To Roxanne's point, by the way, that includes the data centers. When it comes to AI, the data centers themselves and the chips that will power the data centers. So in terms of
Undoubtedly.
anticipating regulation, you're already seeing in the US a focus on the supply chain of where those chips are coming from that might cause risk. And by the way, relatedly, on a positive use of AI, those supply chains are really complex, and it's a great use case for
AI to
machine
map
learning
them.
to
Yeah.
just figure out what the supply chain is to mitigate the
I
risk.
want to go back to something you said, Kevin, though. Republicans and Democrats are on the same hymn sheet. But US tech firms aren't necessarily on the same hymn sheet, or they're singing along without making any noise.
Well, they have businesses to run. And if you want a more secure supply chain that does not involve China or have some nexus with China in some way, you have to do it somewhere else. There's been a multi-decade period of supply chains optimizing in China. And replicating that, it's not just a matter of moving a facility, because it's about the embedded know-how that you can't really replicate, because it came through a long learning process. And so, I think where I see big risks coming down the road is that I can understand why governments, including the US government, but also some other Western countries, are thinking this way about trying to restructure the supply chain. But I don't think anyone's having honest conversations with taxpayers about how expensive that could potentially be over the long term.
We're almost at the end of our time, and I'd like to bring, as I did with the other panel that I was moderating this morning, I'd like to bring the conversation down to earth. We have many business people in the audience today, but also policymakers, and I invite, as the closing theme, each of you to address a segment of the audience and tell them what you think their takeaway should be from this, and particularly because we are an action-orientated group in CogX, not just a forum for ideas, what you think the action point is stemming from today. Perhaps we could move from left to right on this theme.
Well, fundamentally, I think business leaders, so CEOs, they need to understand that the issues that we're talking about here are a boardroom issue. So they need to be grappled with at the highest level, but also that process needs to go all the way down into the organization, all the way down to the level of product managers who are thinking about designing the next generation of products. Geopolitical thinking about tech risk, including cyber risks and risks that could come from AI, but also, on the flip side, the policy risks that we're seeing emanate from Washington and other capitals. It needs to be factored into the most basic business decisions today. There's just no way to responsibly run a business without doing that.
Right at the center of the business plan, yeah.
So I guess three, and I'll direct it to different audiences. One, for the policymakers out there, beg you to consider harmonization. And as you're thinking of new great policy ideas, to think about how they interrelate with other countries. So ideally for a business, it's easy to understand. Two, for businesses, that has not yet happened. So to echo the point that Kevin made, I think it's really, and it's going to be very different depending on your business. Think of the risks and opportunities in AI. There are both. But make sure that someone is explaining it to you in terms you can understand in action what that risk is. And then third, a general point, which is we're at a geopolitical inflection point. The challenge to the post-World War II order has never been as stark as it is right now. And as we're looking in particular, and AI is one of those three, I think, critical technologies that have been identified, who's going to set the rules of the road as to how it's regulated? the fundamental drive behind the answer to that question is you. And so it's going to be whoever develops and uses that technology first will be the one who has the opportunity to set the rules of the road. It doesn't matter if we set the rules of the road, but China gets there first, and so their values inform what the rules and regulations look like. So we have to win the race for AI, and I hope we've given you some thoughts on how to do that today.
Rosanne, the last word is yours.
I'll just give a practical tip based on what you've both said. For the people who are developing AI, building it in the right way is key. We have the opportunity not to develop software or practical applications that are vulnerable. And so choose your partners wisely, right hardware in the right place, choose partners who are ISO 27001 compliant, and build it with the right purpose in mind so that we can actually solve some real-world issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, your expert panel, please give them a warm round of applause of thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.